Thanks very much, Liz. This talk summarises the excavation that took place on this site in advance of and during the construction of the museum. It's getting on for 20 years ago now, so it must be something like 19 years or something like that. We got some cracking archaeology, and I'll try and use it as a bit of an introduction to the background of Liverpool's long and glorious history as well. For those of you who missed the walk this morning, this rather imaginative 19th century view of Liverpool it's accurate in most respects. We have the River Mersey in the foreground, populated with ships, and extending inland a tidal inlet, which is known as the Pool, from which Liverpool derives part of its name. But Liverpool's history really begins in 1207 AD. When it's established as a borough. There are hints of earlier occupation within the city, but it's not even mentioned in Domesday Book at all. It's a relatively young city. And I think large part of its story is a massive topographical change, certainly. The landscape today would be completely unrecognisable. I first rocked up in Liverpool in 1982 with an interest in historic mapping. And what I tried to do is what I always did with places like Chester, Lincoln, etc., is try and work out where the core of the city was. And on a modern map, it's almost impossible to do because the topography's changed so much. So the castle in the middle, built in the 1230s, demolished in the 1720s, was where Derby Square is now, up the hillside. We have the original H-shaped pattern of streets there: Dale Street, Tide Barn Street, Castle Street, the tower on the foreshore on the left-hand side of the slide, and the pool extending inland. By the 1650s, the pool was largely silting up, so that's disappeared. But one of the things you'll notice as you walk down to this site from the city centre is you walk downhill. That hill's quite important to the development of Liverpool as a port, because it meant that when the docks were being constructed, with the technology of the time, it was being very difficult to dig into the land to create the docks. What it meant was they had to build out into the river, so to reclaim land. So that's one of the things that's unique about Liverpool's docks. Places like Bristol, London, etc., docks were constructed by digging into the land. Liverpool's unique, and that's why its topography has changed so much over the past 250 years. Where's my slide disappeared to? That's supposed to be a map of Chadwick's map of Liverpool, 1725. I've no idea what's happened, and I hope that's the only one that's happened to. But we'll move on to the next one, because it'll be clearer. Thank God for that. So, right, okay, this is central Liverpool, 1765, which is expanded. If you've been able to see my previous slide, it's expanded greatly from the original medieval core. The castle's long gone, and in the middle you have what's now known as the Old Dock, built by the corporation in the early 18th century, opened in 1714. And that was really the basis of Liverpool's booming prosperity from the 18th century into the 19th and into the early 20th. For much of the 19th century and the early 20th century, it was the second busiest port in the British Empire after London. And that prosperity is all based upon the old dock, which is now underneath John Lewis's in the centre of Liverpool. And I can highly recommend National Museum's Liverpool tour of the docks down there. Sections of the dock wall have been preserved in situ. So the old dock opens in 1714, and here we see the situation in 1765. So the South Dock, now known as Salthouse Dock, had been built. Takes its name from Thomas Blackburn's salt works, which is just visible on the top. We have the dry pier, the intended dock, which is George's Dock, which is where the Three Graces, so that's the Liver Building, the Cunard Building, and the Port of Liverpool Building now stand. That's there as an intended dock. It was actually under construction at that point. And we're stood more or less where that red rectangle, red square is at the bottom of the slide. So you can see that gives you an impression of the amount of land reclamation that's taken place since the early 18th century. This is Gore, 1796, and we begin to see the present landscape beginning to form. So there's the well, at that point, 3 graving docks, only 2 of them survived. They're outside the building here. George's dock has appeared with a dry basin, but we're still in that red square, still at least partially still in the Mersey at this point. If you'd been here in 1796, you'd have needed water wings. Okay, so this is Horwood, 1803. Some further changes with our red square, which is where the museum site is slightly further inland. The graving docks are there, and you see that you probably can't read it, but that indent extending inland from the square is what was known at the time as Manchester Bay, also known as Manchester Basin, and it was a basin means that it doesn't have lock gates. So when the tide went out, all the water drained out because nothing there to stop it flowing out, which basically meant if you had a ship in that basin, you couldn't load or unload it when the tide was out. Around about 1806, 1807, lock gates were added to Manchester Basin to convert it into Manchester Dock. And we can locate ourselves in the museum on slightly more accurately on this map, and you can see the bar running across the dock gut. The entrance is suggested of lock gates. We know I can date the addition of those to round about 1806 in the Dock Committee minute books, which is an extensive archive relating to the management of Liverpool's docks throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And they reference the then owners of Manchester Dock, the Mersey and Irwell Navigation, working on that part of the waterfront, and it gives day rates for masons, etc., that are employed upon it. So we can date the addition of those lock gates very tightly. That's wonderful because very often in archaeology we use finds to date the archaeology. Here we can use the archaeology to date some of the finds I'll talk about later. There's lots of written descriptions of Liverpool's docks. This is Troughton's History of Liverpool 1810, where he talked, again, this is part of the dating for the addition of the lock gates. Talks about the Manchester Old Quay Company, followed the example of the Duke. That's the Duke of Bridgewater, who then closed Duke's Dock, which is where just the other side of Albert Dock. And he talks about, he alludes to the addition of lock gates to it. Gauge, 1836, really the first reasonably accurate commercial map of Manchester Dock. And you see we've got we're sat more or less here on top of the lock gates. In fact, I suspect this theatre is just about on top of them. If you go to the back of the building, you'll notice in the paving, the entrance lock is marked out in the paving slabs. For some reason, and I can't remember why it didn't happen, it's not marked on that side, but you can work out roughly where you are. There's a brick built building, used to be my office, which is more or less on top of the dock wall, in between the graving docks and Manchester Dock. So you see we've got two sets of lock gates on there, forming a V-shaped pattern, and that arrangement is used to allow you to use the lock at a greater tidal range than if you just had one set of gates. By the early 20th century, Manchester Dock was largely redundant. It was too small, the entrance lock was too narrow, it was hardly used. It was mainly intended for use by a type of shipping called Mersey Flats, which were basically barges with sails. The traffic in those had declined. By the 1920s, it was redundant. So they decided to fill it in, and you can see the stone there being tipped in. That's waste from the excavation of the first Mersey tunnel, being used to fill it in. I think you just about make out a lorry in the background tipping it, and that's largely the stuff that we excavated on the site. This is the excavation. It took place almost exactly 20 years ago, not quite to the day, but like any excavation, we start by stripping off overburden, in this case tarmac, which I've been happily parking my car on for about 5 or 6 years previously. And you can begin to see the dock walls starting to emerge. The bright red stuff is the sandstone infill shoved in the 1920s. I'll spare you the long description of stripping the site and cleaning it all up and how we did it. But to plan it, I was an early adopter of photogrammetry, using that to record sites like this. So what we did was we got a cherry picker. This is taken from 60 meters and predates drones. I'd do it with a drone these days, but back then drones hadn't been invented. So I was stuck with going up in the world's biggest fairground ride. But you can see the site laid out before us. So we've got Manchester, the entrance lock to Manchester Dock. You can see the inside set of lock gates. The outer lock gates are probably still underneath the quay side. We have layouts of transit sheds used for temporary storage of goods. And on the far right, we've got Chester Basin, which is a ferry, an open basin constructed for ferry traffic in the early 19th century. Having cleaned it all up, we started excavating the lock gates. Here you can see the gates starting to emerge, still in situ in the closed position as they have been when the dock was infilled. Cut a quite long story short, we managed to remove those top sections of the gates, and they're on display in the galleries, which you can see during the breaks. The dock itself had some stratigraphy. On the right of that slide, you can see the wall's built of brick and stone. On the left, it's built entirely of sandstone masonry. That junction marks the point between the original Manchester Basin, built in the late 18th century, and the 1806/1807 lock gates. So that blue arrow is pointing to that location. That's the plan produced rectified photographs, and we're looking at that point on Horwood there. So based on dropping the excavated plans onto georeference versions of Horwood, we can work out that the front of that sort of hammer shed head bit that formed part of the original Manchester Basin had been chopped off. That wall there, you can see emerging from the infill, is the head of that pier head starting to emerge. You see it's built out of yellow sandstone rather than red sandstone. A lot of the 18th century docks in Liverpool were built using this sort of softer yellow material. They hadn't got round to using the harder red sandstone at this point. So that's why part of the reason I can be confident that's part of that original 18th century basin. Effectively, we were looking at the bit that blue arrow is pointing to. Moving back to the lock gates, recorded those. There was some quite interesting bits. I've got an interest in industrial archaeology. I'll try and whiz through this fairly quickly because I know we're pushed for time. Those are the lock gates. Looking closely at them, you can probably see that rectangular opening on the left. That's part of the gate opening mechanism, and we've got a wooden plank with numbers engraved upon it. 2019, 2018, etc. That's a depth gauge to the lock gate sill, so vessels knew how much clearance we've got. Okay, very quickly. More opening mechanisms. There would have been a big steel drum on there with a chain wrapped around it, and the chain fed down through shafts in the quay side. Through here, those steel rollers date back to 1807 and still span. The chains came out of the face of the dock wall through there and connected to steel pins on the front, and yeah, the blue arrows pointed to one of them. And those chains were used to open and close the gates. Apologies for the animation, this is like 20 years old, but by pulling on the chains, you open and close the gates. We had masons' marks. I think these are assembly marks, not for piece rate, because the masons were paid a day rate. So they're not masons' marks in the sort of medieval sense of the word. They're assembly marks. It's the depth gauge on display outside. Once that had all been recorded, it's a bulk excavation. This is all landfill, and you have to imagine tumbrils tipping carts, turning up and just tipping this stuff in. There's not a great deal of stratigraphy to make sense of. other than massive tip layers. And you can probably see in the middle there a layer of pottery. That's lots of sugar moulds from the late 18th, early 19th century, tipped in as landfill. Again, on display in the galleries, more tip lines. And a lot of the stuff was lifted in bulk, a lot of it in by jet washing it. There was so much of it. It was the only way we could do it. Lots of Staffordshire porcelain, again on displays. And we ended up with a massive jigsaw puzzle, which my former colleague Jeff Speakman put together. We sampled it, and we had 10,000 sherds, which by Merseyside standards is a massive collection of pottery, 100 kilos. And sorry, something's happened with this. Sugar's a major industry in Liverpool throughout the 19th century. And what's happened here? We had syrup jars. Here we go. Good job, those slides. Sugar, major industry in Liverpool. We're bringing molasses from the Caribbean. It's refined in Liverpool, used to produce sugar loaves. Sugarloaf Mountain is your reference point for that. Large collection of Staffordshire pottery, a lot of it intended for export, decorated with all sorts of people. We've got Marquis Cornwallis, and I'll go to the more interesting ones. Moral poems about not giving credit. A lot of this material seems to be intended for export, but some of it is for import. What we seem to have here is contents of smashed crates from warehouses. There was a lot of repetition in this. This is a representation of a popular early 19th century poem, Werther's Lament, very melodramatic. I'm having to this come on my last minute. Commodes intended for export to the States with the crest of King George on the front. Which side they were selling these to, I have no idea or why, but it's typical Liverpool in the 19th century for anyone. Very mercantile. Tin glazed tiles of the type you find on fireplaces. Lots of tons of tobacco pipes, and I'll have to go very quickly through this. Essentially, this is what I said at the beginning. Because we can date the construction of that part of the dock very accurately, this works in reverse to the way we normally work with finds. We're using the archaeology to date some of these pipes, and David Higgins, the guy who wrote the pipe report, was his talk would be even longer than mine. But we've got lots of kiln fragments from a muffled kiln. Some of those fragments at the top had imprints from newspapers used to line the kilns on the reverse. So lots of interest. Some of them stamped, and we can date them. But these are really useful because we can date them. Although the stamps are useful because they tie into wills, the forms of the pipes can be dated pre-1806. We know when those lock gates were being constructed. Thomas Unwin. And if you want to know even more about this, it has been published, Archaeology Waterfront, along with Archaeology Excavation on the Neptune development, which is the big glass cubes in front of the museum. And apologies for thinking about it as quickly as I can, but there's a lot to get through. Okay, thank you.